It had been nearly 26 years since the morning sunlight spilled across the quiet town of Bellbrook, Ohio, illuminating the day that should have marked the most joyful chapter of Natalie Hargrove's life. The air had been heavy with late summer humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and curled the edges of photographs hung too close to the windows. On that Saturday morning in 1998, the white clapboard Hargrove house buzzed with last-minute preparations. Ribbons hung from porch railings, the scent of gardenias seeped through open windows, and the town's florist was already unloading the last of the arrangements meant for the church. Everyone in town had a part to play, from the baker who had risen before dawn to frost the cake to the elderly neighbor polishing her camera lens on the front lawn, hoping to capture the bride as she stepped into the limousine. But Natalie never walked out that front door. By late afternoon, as the sun dropped low behind the maple trees and guests began shifting uncomfortably in their pews, the bride-to-be had vanished. Years passed, and the Hargrove home changed hands twice. The second owners were a quiet couple from upstate who kept mostly to themselves and never touched the attic. It remained locked with an old iron key they never found its door stiff with decades of paint and dust. Locals still spoke of Natalie's disappearance in low voices, mostly when they thought no one else was listening. Theories abounded, fueled by memory and wine. Some believed she had run off with a secret lover, though no such person was ever identified. Others whispered of foul play implicating either the groom or Natalie's own family. The police investigation had fizzled out by the second anniversary, reduced to a stack of cold files buried somewhere in county storage. Eventually, even the florist stopped setting aside a white gardenia in Natalie's memory each August. Time had a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges of heartbreak. The story might have stayed buried if not for Lila Anderson, a freelance homestager with a passion for restoring historic houses. She was hired by the newest owners of the Hargrove place, a young couple who had bought the property with the dreams of turning it into a bed and breakfast. Lila arrived in early spring, her boots crunching over gravel as she stepped out of her Jeep with a thermos in hand and a canvas bag full of swatches. She didn't know the full history of the place, only that it had once been a wedding venue before something went wrong. What drew her attention was the attic, not for any ghost story, but for the simple fact that it hadn't been staged. She had an eye for symmetry, and the balance of the house felt off. The staircase leading to the attic was hidden behind a false wall of painted beadboard, likely added during a renovation in the early 2000s. When she finally pried it open with a crowbar, a blast of musty air hit her like a wave. She coughed, waving dust from her face, but pressed on. The attic was dim with a single narrow window casting a beam of light across the floorboards. Old furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, and cardboard boxes had collapsed under the weight of time and moisture. Lila moved slowly, her flashlight beam cutting across the dark corners. That was when she saw it. A garment bag, thick with dust, hung on the back of a rusted garment rack. The zipper was stiff, but she managed to pull it down. Inside was a wedding dress. Delicate lace sleeves, pearl buttons along the back, and a full skirt that shimmered faintly even under the weak light. But what made her step back wasn't the dress itself. It was the dark stain spreading across the lower hem, brown and crusted with age, unmistakably dried blood. And scattered at the bottom of the bag were withered petals, gardenias long dead. By the time Lila emerged from the attic, her heart pounded in her ears. The logical part of her brain tried to dismiss the discovery. Old houses were full of odd things. Maybe the stain was rust or tea or something else equally mundane, but her gut told her otherwise. She drove home that night, unable to shake the image from her mind. She didn't tell her clients immediately, fearing it might spook them, but she did call her friend Derek, a local archivist and amateur historian. He remembered the Hargrove case vividly, having grown up just 2 towns over. When Lila described the dress in the attic, he went quiet on the phone for a full 5 seconds before replying. Natalie's wedding dress was never found. Everyone assumed she had been wearing it when she vanished. If you found that Lila, then someone's been hiding something for a long, long time. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, turning the possibilities over in her head. She knew she had stumbled onto something important, something that might explain what really happened to a young woman whose name had become little more than a cautionary tale. But part of her also wondered what the price of knowing might be. She'd always believed the past could be brought back to life through wallpaper paint and careful staging. But now, as the wind rattled her windows and the image of that blood-stained dress danced behind her eyelids, she wasn't so sure. Some stories were hidden for a reason. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. And still something deeper stirred in her. A need to know. Not for the sake of gossip or glory, but for the truth that had been kept buried for over 2 decades. Who had locked that attic? Who had hung the dress like a secret meant to rot in silence? And why now, after all this time, had it finally been found? The answers weren't in the attic, not completely. But Lila had a feeling that if she followed the threads starting with that dress, they would lead her somewhere dark. Somewhere forgotten. Somewhere that still remembered Natalie Hargrove. Lila returned to the Millerton estate 2 days later, her thoughts still entangled with the discovery in the attic. She carried a thermos of lukewarm coffee and a mental list of furniture arrangements. But her focus kept drifting. The dress lingered in her memory like a film she could not turn off. She had contacted the owners the previous night with an innocuous explanation about uncovering some antique items stored in the attic. They gave her permission to inventory anything of interest as long as she labeled it for the appraiser. It was all standard procedure on paper, but Lila knew what she found was anything but standard. Her boots echoed softly against the hardwood floors as she walked through the house again, this time with purpose. She paused at the base of the staircase leading to the attic door, now slightly ajar from her last visit. The narrow steps seemed darker than she remembered. With a breath that steadied her thoughts, she began to climb. The attic greeted her with the same stale air and scattered debris, but this time she noticed something else. Behind a stack of broken wooden chairs lay an old steamer trunk covered in dust and a faded wool blanket. She moved the chairs carefully and knelt beside it. The latch was rusted but intact. With a little force, it popped open and released a puff of moldy air. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten linens, she uncovered a hardbound ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The cover was worn but still legible. Visitor log, Millerton Estate. The pages were thick and yellowed with time, the ink faded but readable. The dates began in 1973 and spanned 2 decades. Each line recorded a name, a date, and occasionally a comment. Lila flipped carefully through the entries, noting the steady frequency of visitors until the early 90s. Then, in the summer of 1998, she found something that made her breath catch. August 14th, 1998. Natalie Hargrove. Bridal suite viewing. No return entry. She stared at the line for a long time. Most visitors had checked out or marked their departure in some form, even if just with initials or scribbles. But Natalie's line ended abruptly. No checkout, no note, just a single entry. Lila flipped forward through the pages. For the next month, there were no additional entries. The handwriting changed slightly by September, indicating a possible new host or employee. Something about that silence struck Lila as significant. She flipped back to the August entries, noting several other names. One in particular stood out. E. Miller, same date, no comment. Her pulse quickened. She took out her phone and snapped pictures of the relevant pages before wrapping the book again and gently placing it back in the trunk. She would need to research those names, but for now, she wanted to document everything before someone else intervened. Downstairs, she sat at the dining room table and uploaded the photos to her laptop. She opened a blank document and began transcribing. The quiet of the house was broken only by the sound of typing and the occasional creak from the old pipes. She cross-referenced the names against local archives, hoping for a match. Evan Miller. Groom. A few public records confirmed the engagement announcement printed in the Belridge Gazette 3 weeks before the wedding date. No records existed for a marriage certificate or divorce proceedings. It was as if the event had simply never happened. Lila leaned back in her chair, the pieces slowly forming a jagged picture. The dress, the attic, the missing bride. and now a log confirming she had been at the estate on the very day she vanished. As the sun began to set, shadows crept across the floorboards, and Lila felt the familiar tug of unease. She knew this place held more than old furniture and memories. Someone had made sure that attic stayed locked for decades. Someone knew Natalie had come here and never left, yet no one had ever reported it. She made a list of every name from that week in August 1998 and planned to visit the county library the next morning. For now, she needed rest. The air felt heavier with each passing hour, as if the house itself did not want her there. She locked up, double-checked the door, and drove home with the sun dipping behind her in a blaze of orange. Back in her apartment, Lila laid the printed photos on her dining table, tracing each name with a pencil. Her cat rubbed against her ankle, sensing her tension. She barely noticed. She circled the 3 entries with no exit notes. Natalie Hargrove, Evan Miller, one other, Harold Wilkes. No mention of Wilkes in the engagement articles or guest list. A mystery name, one without a clear connection. She highlighted it for further investigation. Sleep came in fragments that night. Her mind cycled through possibilities and warnings. What if someone had intentionally hidden these records? What if she was not supposed to find them? The next morning, Lila visited the library archives as planned. The town librarian, an older woman with a sharp memory and an endless curiosity, helped her pull files from 1998. The microfilm reels revealed more details. A wedding cancellation notice had been printed 2 days after the scheduled ceremony. The reason given was simply family emergency. No follow-up story appeared in the weeks that followed. It had been quietly buried. She found one grainy photo of Natalie and Evan from a summer engagement picnic. Natalie wore the same style of dress she had discovered in the attic. Evan stood stiffly beside her, his arm around her waist, but his eyes staring somewhere past the camera. Lila copied the article and took notes on the event location. It was not the estate, but a public park just outside Belridge. By noon, Lila felt both closer and further from the truth. She had confirmed that Natalie had entered the estate. She had identified Evan's signature, and she had found an unconnected name that needed explanation. But the why remained elusive. Why had Natalie never left? Why had Evan never spoken publicly again? Why had no one demanded answers? The estate had hidden this story well, but something in the old bones of that house had started to talk. And Lila was listening. Lila returned to the estate the following day with a firmer sense of direction. She parked her car just off the gravel loop that circled the property, the morning sun filtering through the branches overhead. In her bag, she carried a folder containing the visitor log scans, copies of old news clippings, and a printout of the engagement photo. The plan was simple. She would focus on the master bedroom and its adjoining bridal suite, hoping to find more clues about Natalie's last day at the estate. With the dress and the ledger already unearthed, she was convinced that room held answers no one had bothered to search for. The floorboards groaned under her steps as she crossed the threshold. Dust had settled like a soft blanket across the furniture. The air was dry and still, but the heavy curtains let in narrow beams of gold, slicing through the dimness with quiet insistence. She approached the vanity, its mirror tarnished at the corners. A jewelry box rested on its surface, the lid slightly ajar as if waiting. She reached out slowly and opened the box, half expecting it to be empty. Inside were a few outdated hairpins, a dried corsage, and a small folded piece of paper. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and slanted. It looked like a note unsigned, and its content immediately tightened her chest. It read simply, "If you change your mind, I will be in the garden at dusk. No one else has to know. You deserve more than this." Lila read it twice, her eyes darting across the lines, hoping for a signature or initials. There were none. She photographed the note, then placed it gently back inside the jewelry box. The letter sounded intimate but vague, as if the writer knew they were taking a risk even writing it. She wondered if Natalie had received it, if she'd gone to the garden that evening. Lila moved to the window and pushed the curtain aside. From the second floor, she could see the overgrown hedges and the broken sundial at the center of the garden path. It would have been quiet and private at sunset. the perfect place to meet in secret. She made her way downstairs and out to the garden. The air smelled of soil and faded lavender. Weeds had overtaken much of the path, but the old stone benches remained intact, half covered in moss. She followed the curve of the walkway to the sundial, pausing to scan the area for any signs of disruption or past digging. Her eyes caught something unusual along the base of the brick wall that bordered the garden. A cluster of bricks seemed slightly discolored, newer perhaps, though they still bore the mark of weather. She approached slowly and knelt down. The soil around the base looked compacted but disturbed. Lila took photos from several angles, unsure yet unwilling to dismiss her instinct. She made a mental note to bring a trowel next time. She stood and turned toward the bench. The view from there would have given a direct line of sight to the second-story bridal suite. A person waiting at dusk would have seen any movement upstairs. That small detail made the note feel more strategic, as if someone had planned a rendezvous with awareness of the house's layout. Back inside, she returned to the master suite and stood before the large, freestanding mirror near the closet. Its surface was slightly cloudy with streaks from age. She wiped a corner with her sleeve and noticed something odd beneath the glass. A faint shape, rectangular, as if something had been slipped behind the mirror from the back. Her breath quickened. She examined the frame carefully. The mirror was secured with screws at the sides, which she loosened with a small screwdriver from her bag. Carefully, she lifted the mirror and saw it another folded paper, yellowed and brittle, tucked between the backing and the wood. This one had writing too, but unlike the garden note, it was sharper, angrier. It read, "You promised. I left everything for you. Do not pretend I do not exist." The paper had been torn at the edge like it had been ripped hastily from a notebook. No name was attached, but the tone suggested someone close. Someone betrayed. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. 2 notes, likely written days apart. One hopeful, one bitter. She began to see a clearer picture, not of a bride fleeing cold feet, but of a young woman pulled in 2 directions. If Natalie had received both notes, she might have faced a decision no one ever considered. Not a simple choice between wedding and escape, but between secrets that held consequences. Lila took photos of the second note and replaced the mirror carefully. She then searched the closet, the drawers, and the nightstand. Most items were mundane relics of a former era. But inside the back of the nightstand drawer she found a business card. It had faded ink and a frayed edge. Harold Wilkes, estate grounds manager. No address, just a number. She stepped outside again and walked to the rear shed near the overgrown tennis court. It had once stored equipment for gardening and maintenance. She jimmied the lock with a small crowbar and pushed the door open. Inside were rusty tools, a ladder, a few tarps, and a wall of old shelving. Among the clutter, she found a weathered clipboard hanging on a nail. It had maintenance logs dating back years. Most were signed H.W. and detailed routine tasks, but one entry stood out. August 15th, 1998. Broken trellis, cleaned fountain area, repaired garden wall by sundial. That final note hit her like a chill. If the garden wall had been altered the day after Natalie disappeared, it could mean someone had hidden something there. A message, an object. Or worse. She copied the page, closed the shed, and walked back to her car, her thoughts weighing heavy. She now had enough pieces to build a narrative few people would believe. Natalie had received a message inviting her to the garden, likely from someone who cared deeply for her. At the same time, she had been threatened or confronted by someone else angry and perhaps dangerous. She went to the garden, met someone, and never returned. The next day, the grounds manager repaired the wall. The pattern was too precise to ignore. Lila needed to verify if Harold Wilkes was still alive, and if so, whether he would speak. Her search had moved from dusty rooms into the realm of living memory. She had crossed a threshold. There would be no turning back. Lila sat at her kitchen table that evening with a notebook open in front of her. Her laptop glowed softly in the corner, the cursor blinking on a search bar where she had typed Harold Wilkes, Belridge, Ohio. The internet returned scattered results, most of which were outdated directory listings or mentions in local newsletters. After scrolling through pages of irrelevant links, she came across an obituary that gave her pause. It was dated 5 years ago and listed a Harold Wilkes of Belridge, aged 71, survived by one son, Curtis Wilkes. The obituary was short, almost impersonal, with no mention of military service or past employment. She stared at it for several seconds, chewing her lower lip. If Harold had passed, then the only remaining thread might be his son. Lila jotted down the funeral home that handled the service and the name of the town where Curtis had been listed as next of kin. It was a neighboring area called Cropsville, about 30 minutes south. The next morning, Lila set off with a printed copy of the obituary in her folder of notes. Cropsville was smaller than Belridge, its downtown consisting of 2 diners, a post office, and a courthouse with a chipped marble plaque from 1924. She found the address listed on the funeral records, a small 1-story house with a sun-faded porch swing and patchy lawn. She parked across the street and took a moment to gather her thoughts. Approaching people about secrets buried decades ago was not something she had training for, but her instincts told her this visit might matter more than any other clue she had uncovered. She walked to the door and knocked. A man in his 40s opened it, wearing a gray t-shirt and a cautious expression. Lila introduced herself, mentioning she was researching historical properties and that she had come across Harold's name in estate records. Curtis squinted at her for a moment, then nodded slowly and stepped outside to speak. They sat on the porch and Curtis pulled a baseball cap over his eyes as the sun climbed higher. When Lila asked about the Millerton estate, his demeanor shifted. He admitted he had visited the property as a boy when his father worked there, but claimed he had not set foot on the grounds since Harold's retirement. When Lila mentioned August of 1998, his shoulders tensed. He said his father never talked about that time, but he remembered overhearing an argument at home. Harold had been upset about something, kept repeating that he had warned them it was a bad idea. When Lila asked who he had meant by them, Curtis hesitated. He then mentioned a name she had not yet heard in her investigation: Evelyn Row. She had been part of the estate board, someone who had managed bookings and appearances. Curtis remembered her coming to the house once, late at night during that same week in August. After she left, his father seemed disturbed, almost paranoid. Lila wrote the name Evelyn Row in her notebook and thanked Curtis for his time. He gave her a long look as she stood to leave. He said if she planned to dig any deeper, she should be careful who she asked. His father had always said there were people who wanted the past to stay buried not out of guilt, but because the truth would cost them everything. Lila drove back to Belridge with the name Evelyn Row echoing in her head. A quick search showed that Evelyn had once served on the Belridge Historical Trust, which oversaw several properties in the area, including the Millerton estate. She was now in her early 70s and lived in a retirement community on the west side of town. Lila decided not to wait. The sun was still high, and her thoughts refused to quiet. She drove directly to Rosemeadow, living the facility where Evelyn was listed. The building was modern and understated, with trimmed hedges and a circular driveway lined with flower beds. At the front desk, Lila introduced herself using her real name, but softened the purpose of her visit. She said she was working on a local heritage documentary and hoped to speak with Evelyn Row about the Millerton estate's historical timeline. The receptionist asked her to wait a moment and made a call to one of the staff wings. After a brief pause, she returned with a clipboard and an approving nod. Evelyn Row was available for a short chat. They would meet in the facility's small library. Lila followed the attendant past quiet hallways and into a softly lit room with shelves of old books, 2 floral chairs, and a view of the courtyard. Evelyn was already seated. Her white hair was swept into a neat bun, and she wore a lilac sweater with a pin shaped like a magnolia. Her eyes followed Lila closely as she entered, sharp but not unkind. Lila greeted her and sat in the chair across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn gestured for her to begin. Lila started gently describing her recent inheritance of the Millerton estate and the strange items she had found in the attic. Evelyn listened, without changing expression, her hands folded in her lap. When Lila mentioned Natalie Hargrove's name, Evelyn's gaze dropped slightly, not in surprise, but as if remembering something she had kept pressed beneath the surface for years. Evelyn spoke with slow precision. She said Natalie had been poised polite and intensely private. In the weeks before the wedding, she had requested several unscheduled visits to the estate. She said she wanted to see the bridal suite in different light, to photograph the garden under various conditions. At the time, Evelyn had assumed it was for sentimental reasons. But Natalie had also asked questions. She had wanted to know about the structural changes to the house, about any rooms that had been sealed off or repurposed. Evelyn admitted she had found it strange, especially coming from a bride. She now believed Natalie had uncovered something she had not been meant to find. When Lila asked if Evelyn remembered Harold Wilkes, Evelyn's hands tightened slightly on her lap. She said Harold had been a good man, quiet and reliable. She remembered he had been uneasy that week, always glancing over his shoulder. On the morning of the wedding, he had requested a last-minute job to clean and patch a segment of the garden wall. Evelyn had given the approval without asking questions. She regretted that now. Lila then asked if Evelyn had ever spoken with Natalie privately in the days before her disappearance. Evelyn nodded and said they had spoken briefly in the sunroom. Natalie had asked if anyone else had access to the estate's original blueprints. She seemed nervous, as if she suspected someone was watching her. Evelyn had told her that only the trust board had copies, and Natalie had gone quiet after that. Evelyn never saw her again. The silence that followed stretched longer than either of them expected. Evelyn then looked Lila directly in the eyes. She said that when Natalie vanished, she had known it was not a case of cold feet, but the people in charge had insisted otherwise. There had been pressure to keep the estate's reputation intact. Evelyn admitted she had written a note to herself that night recording the time of the last sighting and the fact that a call came from a payphone the next day claiming Natalie had not run. She said she kept the note in her personal ledger hidden for years. She asked Lila if she would like to see it. Lila nodded, trying to keep her breath steady. Evelyn rose carefully and walked to the corner cabinet. From behind a stack of crossword books, she pulled out a narrow journal bound in blue fabric. She opened it to a marked page and passed it to Lila. The entry was dated August 22, 1998. It described a phone call received at 9:43 a.m. A woman's voice, low and rushed, had said the bride did not leave by choice, that she was scared, that she needed help. The call had cut off before Evelyn could ask questions. She had written down the exact phrasing and time but had never shared it with the police. She said she feared being implicated or worse, discredited. Over time, she convinced herself there was nothing she could have done. Now, she was not so sure. Lila took a photograph of the page with Evelyn's permission and thanked her sincerely. As she stood to leave, Evelyn said something that stayed with her. Sometimes people believe silence keeps them safe, but silence can rot the soul more than guilt ever will. Lila sat in the parking lot of Rosemeadow Living, staring at the main entrance through her windshield. The building was quiet and well kept, with flower beds trimmed and a small flag fluttering near the door. She had called ahead that morning, asking if Evelyn Row would be open to a brief visit regarding historical records from the Belridge Trust. The receptionist had said Miss Row was still sharp, though she preferred mornings, and disliked surprise visitors. Lila had secured a short window to speak with her in the library room, and now that the time had come, she felt a strange nervousness tighten her chest. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, her folder pressed against her ribs like a shield. The front desk attendant gave her a badge and pointed toward the east wing where Evelyn was waiting. The library was small but inviting, with 2 cushioned armchairs near a window and a wall of donated paperbacks. Evelyn sat by the window wearing a lavender cardigan and reading glasses pushed halfway down her nose. Lila introduced herself again, then carefully sat opposite her. Evelyn studied her with a gaze that was both calm and discerning. When Lila mentioned the Millerton estate in the year 1998, Evelyn blinked slowly but said nothing at first. After a pause, she closed her book and folded her hands in her lap. She asked what exactly Lila was looking for, and Lila responded with what she had found so far: the wedding dress, the visitor ledger, the 2 letters, and the name of Harold Wilkes. She did not show the physical evidence yet, instead watching Evelyn's reaction. The older woman sat still, the light catching the fine lines around her eyes. Then she sighed and leaned back in her chair. She said she had managed bookings for the estate from 1989 until 2002 and had seen every kind of event unfold on the property. Weddings, birthdays, memorials, reunions. The Hargrove wedding had been one of the most carefully planned she had ever overseen. She remembered Natalie as quiet but elegant, a girl who carried a kind of sorrow beneath her composure. Evelyn's expression changed slightly as she recalled Evan Miller. She described him as well-mannered but distant, the sort of man who took direction but never really listened. Lila asked if Evelyn remembered the day Natalie disappeared. Evelyn said she remembered it vividly. According to Evelyn, Natalie had arrived at the estate earlier than expected on the morning of the wedding. Evelyn had shown her to the bridal suite where the final fittings were to take place. Everything had been prepared. By noon, Evelyn left to meet with the florist and returned by 3. When she knocked on the door to check in, there was no answer. She assumed Natalie had gone downstairs or stepped out. It was not until the groom arrived around 5 and asked where she was that people began to worry. Evelyn said she searched the grounds, the dressing room, even checked the garden herself. Lila asked if anyone contacted police that evening. Evelyn said they had, but only after the family insisted. At first, they thought it was cold feet. The idea that she had simply vanished was not accepted until much later. Lila then asked Evelyn if she remembered Harold Wilkes working on the garden wall that weekend. Evelyn nodded. She said Harold was reliable and quiet. He always kept to himself. He never questioned requests, even if they were sudden. That day, he had come to her office asking if she needed anything else done before the week's end. She told him to clear out the broken trellis in the garden, as it had been knocked over during the setup. When Lila mentioned that Harold had later told his son he regretted something about that week, Evelyn looked surprised. She said she had no idea he had shared concerns. She remembered he seemed tense that afternoon, but he had always kept his emotions guarded. Then Lila asked directly if Evelyn had received any letter from Natalie, or if she had any idea who might have written the notes Lila found. Evelyn shook her head. She said no such letters were ever brought to her attention. But she did admit something else. A week after the disappearance, she had received a call from someone using a payphone, a woman who spoke in a low voice and said only one thing. She said Natalie did not run. She did not leave because she wanted to. Evelyn said she wrote it down in her ledger that day but never showed anyone. She feared it was a prank, or worse, a trap. The call was never traced. When Lila asked if she still had that ledger, Evelyn stood slowly and walked to a locked cabinet. She opened it with a small key from her necklace and pulled out a weathered brown book. Lila turned the pages carefully. In the middle of an entry labeled August 21st, 1998, there it was in neat pen. Woman called. Said Natalie did not run. Said she did not choose this. Payphone noise in background. Lila photographed the page with Evelyn's permission. As she returned the book, Evelyn looked at her with quiet urgency. She said she had tried for years to forget what happened. She had convinced herself there was nothing else she could do. But if Lila believed the house still held answers, then she should follow every lead. Evelyn said she remembered one more thing. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Natalie had started asking questions about the estate itself. Not the decor or layout, but the history. She had visited the town hall twice and had checked out blueprints. Evelyn thought it strange at the time, but Natalie had said she just wanted to feel connected to the place where she would begin her life. Lila left with more questions than answers, but also with a name for her next step, the town hall archives. The Belridge Town Hall stood like a preserved relic, its sandstone exterior chipped in places but still dignified. Lila walked through its front entrance shortly after it opened, greeted by the faint smell of paper and floor wax. She had called ahead to arrange time in the records room, explaining she was researching the Millerton estate for a restoration proposal. The clerk, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, led her past a hallway of framed mayors and into a room filled with filing cabinets, rolled blueprints, and dust-heavy binders. Lila thanked her and set her bag down on the long table in the center. The morning light fell through high windows, catching dust motes in its glow as she began her search. The building plans were organized by address, and she quickly found a drawer labeled Millerton. Inside were various floor plans dating back to 1902, some revised as recently as 1997. She spread them out on the table and took her time comparing the layers. The original plans showed a different layout for the west wing of the house. What caught her eye was a notation in the 1976 version where a storage room had been marked for conversion into a utility space. However, that same area disappeared from the 1997 plans. In the newest version, the room was missing altogether. No mention of removal, no change in square footage, just gone. Lila highlighted the spot and compared it to the hallway leading past the bridal suite. There should have been a narrow chamber behind the linen closet. She marked it and rolled the plans carefully into a tube for reference. Back at the estate, Lila wasted no time. She entered through the rear, took the familiar staircase to the second floor, and walked to the hallway where the bridal suite stood. She counted the steps from the doorframe to the back corner of the hall. According to the plan, there should have been a space roughly 5 by 8 feet hidden behind the wall. The linen closet backed up to it, but there was no indication of a door or panel. She opened the closet and cleared the shelves, pressing her palms against the backboard. It sounded hollow. She knocked again more firmly, then reached for the screwdriver in her satchel. She pried at the seams until the backboard gave way, revealing dark wood and cobwebs behind it. The cavity was cramped and smelled of mildew. With her flashlight in hand, Lila leaned inside. At first, she saw only old insulation and wooden beams, but then her light caught something metallic. She crawled further in and discovered a rusted latch set into the floor. It connected to a recessed panel, possibly a trapdoor. Her breath quickened as she examined it. The edges were sealed with age, but the wood had softened. She worked the latch loose and pried it open, revealing a short ladder leading downward. It was too steep to be a crawl space and too small for a basement stairwell. She lowered her feet onto the ladder and descended. The space below was tight and windowless, no more than 7 feet across. It looked like a storage area, but the air felt stagnant and heavy, like it had not been disturbed in decades. On the floor was a small trunk, its leather top split and peeling. She opened it and found a bundle of clothes folded with care. On top was a white shoe, its heel broken, its satin yellowed with age. Beneath the clothes was a canvas pouch containing personal items, a hairbrush, a compact mirror, and a torn envelope addressed to Natalie Hargrove. The letter inside was stained but legible. It was written in shaky penmanship and contained only a few lines. It said she had changed her mind. She was not ready. She needed time, and she was scared of what would happen if she told Evan. Lila's chest tightened as she sat in the gloom of that hidden space. The letter read like a farewell, but not a runaway note. It was written with fear, not liberation. She photographed it, then returned the items carefully. She stood and shined her light along the walls. Scratches marked the plaster near the corner. Not deep, but deliberate. She reached out and traced them. There were 5 lines, uneven and faint, like someone had clawed at the surface. Her throat tightened. Someone had been in here, possibly locked in long enough to leave behind a message of their presence. She climbed out slowly, her hands trembling as she sealed the opening behind her and returned the linen closet to its original state. Lila sat on the floor outside the closet, catching her breath. She thought of Evelyn's ledger note about the mysterious call. She thought of the visitor log with names that had never signed out. Most of all, she thought of the letter Natalie had written, never sent, never received. Lila now believed Natalie had gone into hiding, even if only for a moment, seeking refuge in a space that had been quietly erased from the floor plans. But someone had known about it. Someone had closed her in. That person had either found her alive or found her letter and decided it was too dangerous to share. Lila's pulse raced with questions. Had Harold sealed the room? Had Evelyn known and kept silent? Or had someone else entirely known of that hidden chamber someone never listed in the records? She packed her camera and notes, walked downstairs and locked the door behind her. Her next stop would be the newspaper archive. Someone might have photographed the estate around the time of the wedding. If that space had existed in previous years, maybe it had appeared in older photos before its removal from the records. She needed to confirm the timeline. If Natalie disappeared into a room no one acknowledged, then the truth had been carefully constructed to protect someone. Her next task would be to figure out who had the most to lose. The Bell Ridge Gazette had an archives room tucked behind the main newsroom, a modest space with cabinets full of yellowing clippings and plastic tubs of photo negatives. Lila arrived just after lunch, notebook in hand, and a quiet determination etched into her face. She had spoken to the editor the previous day and was granted access to old event files specifically from the summer of 1998. The assistant editor, a man in his 60s named Mark, remembered the Hargrove case. He was young, then a junior photographer, but he still recalled the sense of unease that lingered in the newsroom after the bride vanished. Mark led her to the back room and unlocked the filing cabinet labeled Events 98. He offered her coffee, but Lila declined, already absorbed in the stacks of folders marked with thick black dates. She searched through weddings and society pages, pulling any envelopes that contained film negatives or contact sheets. Most were of garden parties or ribbon cuttings, mundane snapshots of suburban life. Then she found the Hargrove file. It was thinner than expected, but inside were 2 black and white contact sheets, a few enlarged prints, and one undeveloped roll of 35 mm film. The sheets showed the day before the wedding. One photo captured Natalie standing near the garden fountain, her hands resting on the stone ledge. Evan stood to her left holding her elbow. There was something off about the way they faced each other. Natalie's posture looked tense, and Evan's grip seemed controlling rather than affectionate. In another photo, Evelyn Row appeared beside them, her hand on Natalie's back as if ushering her forward. Lila examined each image closely, then turned to the envelope with the undeveloped roll. Mark allowed her to use the paper lab on the second floor. Within an hour, she had negatives on the light box and began developing prints. As the photos emerged, one stood out. It was taken from inside the house through the glass of the second-story hallway looking down at the garden. The angle suggested it had been taken by someone inside the bridal suite. Natalie stood below her face, tilted toward a man Lila did not recognize. He was older, balding, and wore a dark suit. The two seemed locked in conversation. Natalie was reaching for his hand. Lila stared at the man's profile, unsure who he was, but her instinct told her he mattered. She brought the print to Mark, who squinted at it under the desk lamp. He studied the man and frowned. He said the photo must have been taken by accident, likely from a second shooter assigned that day. Then he offered a possibility. The man looked like Robert Langley, a local attorney who handled estate paperwork and had once served on the Bell Ridge Historic Preservation Council. Mark believed Langley had a minor role in the Millerton transition to public use, which would explain his presence. Lila searched Langley's name online and found a small law office still registered under his name. She called and left a message requesting a brief meeting about the estate's records. She did not mention Natalie. The secretary confirmed an appointment for the next day. That night, Lila spread the photos across her kitchen table. She traced connections on a legal pad, circling names and arrows. The man in the photo had known Evelyn, who had denied any direct involvement with planning beyond logistics. But the photo said otherwise. Natalie had met him alone. Why had no one mentioned it? She also noted the lack of photos after that moment. The contact sheets ended abruptly. The roll had not been fully used. Perhaps it had been removed prematurely, or someone had intentionally withheld further documentation. Either way, there was a clear effort to control what was remembered. Lila folded the prints into protective sleeves and prepared her questions for Langley. Robert Langley's office sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth inside a restored brick building with a green awning. The receptionist led Lila into a wood-paneled room filled with books and antique brass lamps. Langley entered moments later, older than in the photo but recognizable. He had a firm handshake and a guarded smile. Lila explained she was researching architectural history and came across his name in relation to the Millerton estate. He nodded politely and confirmed his involvement in reviewing the property's compliance during its transition to a historical site. When she asked about the Hargrove wedding, he paused, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. He said he remembered the event mostly because of what followed. It was a scandal for the town and people had whispered for months. Lila showed him the photograph. His reaction was subtle but telling. He leaned in, adjusted his glasses, and grew very still. He said he did remember speaking to Natalie the day before the ceremony. She had approached him with questions about the estate's private ownership clauses. Specifically, she wanted to know if there were sections of the property that remained off the public record. He found her questions curious but dismissed them at the time as pre-wedding anxiety. When Lila asked if he knew about the missing storage room behind the bridal suite, he blinked slowly. Then he admitted there had been early drafts of the estate's plans that included a servants' hallway that was later removed from official maps. He could not recall who ordered its removal. Langley added that Natalie seemed distressed during their conversation. She spoke quickly and mentioned she had found something troubling. When he pressed her to explain, she changed the subject. He offered to speak with her family, but she declined. She thanked him and walked back toward the garden. He assumed she had found peace with whatever concerned her. Langley admitted that in retrospect her demeanor was not just nervous, but fearful. He had not realized it at the time. Lila thanked him and left with a deepening sense of unease. If Natalie had discovered something before her wedding, something tied to the house's secrets, then perhaps someone had taken steps to silence her. The following morning, Lila returned to the estate. Her key slid easily into the lock, the creak of the front door now familiar. The air inside remained musty and still thick with the scent of old wood and damp fabric. Her focus turned to the first floor. Up to this point, she had concentrated on the attic, the bridal suite, and the garden, but there were areas she had not fully explored. The study, tucked away near the front parlor, had always seemed less relevant, but the realization struck her that if someone had coordinated a cover-up, they might have left behind something less obvious. She crossed the foyer and pushed the study door open. It groaned slightly on its hinges. Afternoon light filtered in through slatted blinds, casting pale stripes across the shelves and the worn leather armchair near the fireplace. She stepped inside and moved toward the large desk against the wall. The top was covered in dust, but a blotter and an empty inkstand still sat in the center. Lila opened the drawers slowly, working left to right. Most were filled with nothing but paper clips, dried pens, and faded notepads. Then she reached the final drawer. It stuck slightly swollen from humidity. She gave it a firm pull, and it opened with a rasp. Inside was a small wooden box secured with a hook latch. She lifted it out and placed it on the desk. The box was old, but intact. With careful hands, she opened it. Inside, there were several yellowed envelopes and a single cassette tape. The envelopes were addressed to Evelyn Row and had no stamps or postal markings. Someone had delivered them by hand. Lila opened the first and read slowly. The handwriting was the same slanted style she had seen in the attic note. The letter was dated August 13, 1998, and referenced a meeting with Natalie. The tone was concerned but cryptic. It said Natalie had learned something about the estate's legal status and feared that portions of the property were being used for personal gain under the guise of public funding. It also mentioned a fear of being followed and requested that Evelyn take certain records to a safe place. The second letter, dated 2 days later, was shorter. It said simply that Natalie was planning to confront Evan that evening, and if anything happened, someone should look behind the bridal suite. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she opened the third letter. This one was different. The ink was darker, more rushed. It appeared to be a confession. The writer, who never signed their name, described an argument between Natalie and Evan on the night before the wedding. It stated that Evan had grown increasingly agitated over the past week, convinced Natalie was hiding something. The letter claimed that in a moment of anger he followed her through the house and threatened her. The writer admitted they saw part of the argument but did not intervene. They later found Natalie's handbag in the hidden room and assumed she had locked herself inside. Panic followed. Rather than report the incident, the writer claimed they sealed the room and left everything in place. The words ended abruptly, as if the writer had stopped mid-thought. There was no signature, no date. Lila stared at the tape. She found an old cassette player in the corner cabinet and inserted it. After a brief hiss, a voice came through. It was male, measured and weary. The man introduced himself as Harold Wilkes. He said he was recording the message in case something happened to him. His voice cracked when he mentioned the Hargrove girl. He described seeing her in the hallway near the linen closet on the days she vanished. He said he heard shouting, but when he returned minutes later, the hallway was silent. He later found the secret door open and the ladder down. He called out but received no answer. He did not enter the space. Hours later, Evelyn instructed him to patch the garden wall. He said he did not understand why until years later when he realized what had been hidden. The tape ended with Harold saying he regretted following orders. He wished he had gone into that room. He said if anyone ever listened to the recording, they should search the foundation wall behind the old sundial. There he had buried something he was too afraid to reveal while alive. Lila sat in the quiet study, the tape still spinning. Her mind whirled with the implications. This was no longer a mystery of absence, but a chain of deliberate actions. Natalie had not only been silenced, but her final moments had been observed, known, and concealed by multiple people. Evelyn, Evan, Harold, and perhaps even others on the estate board had played roles in hiding what had happened. Lila took the letters, and the tape stored them in her bag and returned to the garden. The sundial stood in the same place, its edges flaked with age. She knelt by the wall Harold had referenced and examined the soil. The bricks were aged, but one had a faint discoloration at the edge. Using a flat screwdriver, she pried at it until it loosened. Behind it, buried in a small cavity, was a metal tin wrapped in plastic. She pulled it free, heart pounding. Inside were photographs clearly taken with a personal camera of Natalie and Evan arguing near the fountain. Another showed Evelyn walking alone toward the garden wall. The final photo was of Natalie entering the linen closet. Also inside was Natalie's compact mirror. It had her initials etched into the back. Lila held it tightly. This was no longer just pieces of a story, it was a timeline recorded in voices, letters, and images. She returned to her car and drove home in silence. That night she documented every item, scanned every photo, and wrote a summary of the events as she now understood them. The story had never been about a vanished bride. It had been about a truth hidden behind social standing, legal silence, and fear. Natalie had tried to resist. She had sought help, and others had chosen silence. The morning air felt colder than usual as Lila walked into the Belridge Police Department, a simple brick building nestled between the public library and a bakery. She carried a sealed manila envelope under her arm, inside of which were photocopies of the photographs Harold Wilkes' recorded confession and scanned letters addressed to Evelyn Row. Her heart beat with a slow insistence, not out of fear, but anticipation. The truth had taken shape, and now it needed to be recognized by more than just her. She approached the front desk and introduced herself to the officer on duty. She asked to speak with someone from the department's cold case unit. A young detective named Carver appeared a few minutes later, curious but polite, and led her into a side office. Lila laid out the documents in careful sequence. She explained the discovery of the visitor ledger, the letters, the hidden room, and Harold's final message. Carver remained silent for most of her explanation, taking notes with a pencil that tapped occasionally against the side of his notebook. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and asked if she had anything physical beyond the scans. Lila opened her bag and handed him the compact mirror with Natalie's initials in the tin that had held the photographs. He examined them carefully, then promised to involve the department's historical liaison for further verification. Carver did not offer immediate validation, but his face showed something close to belief. He said he would review the materials that afternoon and contact her by the end of the week. Lila left the station feeling both lighter and strangely anxious. For months, she had unraveled secrets, followed faint clues, and finally held something concrete. Yet, part of her wondered what justice would look like after so many years. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered, and a familiar voice came through. It was Curtis Wilkes. He said there was something else she needed to see. After his father passed, he had packed up most of the belongings into storage. But one item had remained in the garage too heavy to move and too unfamiliar to discard. It was a wooden box nailed shut, marked with the initials NH. He never opened it out of guilt or fear, but now he believed Lila was the person meant to see what was inside. She drove to Cropsville again that same afternoon, the clouds hanging low and gray above the rolling hills. Curtis met her in the driveway, gesturing toward the garage with a stiff nod. Inside, against the far wall, stood the box. It was about the size of a footlocker, the wood dark and slightly warped from age. The initials were carved into the top deep and unmistakable. Curtis stepped back, and Lila approached with slow steps. She ran her fingers across the letters, then reached for the hammer he offered. Carefully, she began prying open the nails along the edge. It took time, but eventually the lid gave way with a dull creak. Inside, everything was wrapped in thick layers of linen and newspaper. The first item she unwrapped was a pair of ballet slippers, still slightly pink with faint wear along the soles. Next came a journal bound in faded leather. The front page was signed in Natalie's looping handwriting. Lila flipped through it and realized it was not a diary but a log. Natalie had documented her discoveries about the estate over several months. She had included drawings of floor plans, lists of discrepancies and funding reports, and notes about overheard conversations between Evelyn and board members. She mentioned a safe in the cellar where she believed financial records were hidden. Each page built a portrait of someone methodical, scared, but determined to protect herself with facts. Beneath the journal was a plastic sleeve containing torn photographs, some of which had been scorched at the corners. One showed Evan standing beside a car with a briefcase. Another captured Evelyn walking with a ledger tucked under her arm. These were surveillance photos taken discreetly. Lila realized Natalie had likely taken them herself or had help. Tucked inside a smaller envelope was a folded note addressed simply to whomever finds this. The message was short. Natalie wrote that she feared something might happen before the wedding. She stated clearly that she had not run away and that if she disappeared, the truth could be found in her journal and the safe. Her words were clear, desperate, and final. Curtis stepped forward and looked into the box with a strange mixture of regret and relief. He said his father must have hidden the box for safekeeping, hoping someone would one day finish what Natalie started. Lila nodded slowly and rewrapped the items with care. She thanked Curtis and promised she would take everything to the police the next morning. That night, Lila read the journal cover to cover. The details were chilling. Natalie had uncovered that funds allocated to restore portions of the estate had been diverted to private accounts. She named Evelyn, and a third board member named Clay Darren. She also mentioned a housekeeper named Teresa who had resigned abruptly 2 weeks before the wedding. Lila jotted the names into her growing web of connections. As she closed the journal, she looked at the compact mirror again. It was a small thing, but in Natalie's world it might have been the last item she touched, the last object that reflected her face before she vanished. Lila placed it next to the journal and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would bring everything to Carver. She did not know what would follow. Arrests might never happen. Charges might not stick. But the truth had a weight, and now it would be known. Natalie had tried to leave behind the truth in pieces. Lila had gathered them. Now it was time for others to carry it forward. Lila arrived at the Belridge Police Department early, the morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. The box sat on the passenger seat beside her, sealed once more, but this time accompanied by a letter she had written the night before. In it, she outlined every step of her investigation, from the hidden visitor log to the trapdoor behind the linen closet, and finally to Natalie's journal. It was not just a summary of facts, but a plea. She asked that Natalie Hargrove's name be officially cleared of any suggestion that she had willingly disappeared or abandoned her life. The truth was layered and painful, but above all, it deserved acknowledgement. Lila carried the box inside, and he was met by Detective Carver, who motioned her into the same small office they had used before. She handed over the box and the letter, then sat quietly as he reviewed the items with slow, deliberate care. Carver listened without interruption as she described what she had found in Natalie's journal. He asked measured questions about the photographs the letter addressed to whomever finds this, and the names mentioned within. His tone remained professional, but his eyes occasionally betrayed a deeper reaction. He paused when Lila explained the pattern of surveillance Natalie had documented, and the fact that she had identified financial irregularities tied to specific individuals. Carver admitted he would need to involve a prosecutor to determine how far the statute of limitations extended on some charges, but he also acknowledged that the evidence painted a deeply troubling picture. He promised that the department would reclassify the case from voluntary disappearance to suspicious death under unresolved circumstances. It was a small step, but it meant Natalie's name would be cleared in official records. As Lila left the building, she found herself drawn back to the estate one last time. She drove slowly, passing the familiar streets and silent neighborhoods until the gates of the Millerton property appeared. She parked along the gravel curve and walked through the entryway, the keys in her hand, feeling heavier than ever before. Inside the house remained still, every creak and shadow, a reminder of how many truths had been hidden within its walls. She moved from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the bridal suite, the study, the back hallways. She paused at the linen closet and placed her palm against the smooth wood where the hidden room had once been sealed. Her mind filled with the image of Natalie standing there holding a letter or a journal, wondering who she could trust. Lila stepped out into the garden, the afternoon sun filtering through the overgrown hedges. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds gave the space a strange serenity. She sat on the stone bench beside the sundial and closed her eyes. This was where the final pieces had been found, where broken truth had begun to mend. She thought about the lives that had intersected in this space, how choices made in fear or ambition had rippled outward, affecting not just Natalie, but an entire community. Evelyn's silence. Harold's remorse. Evan's control all had played roles in the erasure of a young woman's story. But the evidence had survived, and now it spoke. That evening, Lila returned to her apartment and began writing. Not a police report, not an affidavit, but a true account. She wrote in the first person, describing how she came to inherit the estate, how the dress in the attic had stirred a memory, how each discovery had pulled her deeper into the past. She wrote about Natalie not as a mystery, but as a person. Someone curious, someone scared, someone who tried to act with courage even when the walls closed in. Lila included photographs, excerpts from the journal, and her own reflections. She did not soften the facts, but she infused them with empathy. The piece would become a feature in a regional magazine, and later it would be picked up by a national outlet. The response was immediate. Letters arrived not just from Belridge, but from towns across the state. Former classmates of Natalie's shared memories, stories of kindness and intelligence. A teacher from her high school wrote to say she had always suspected Natalie had a secret she never shared. One letter came from a woman who claimed she had also booked a wedding at the Millerton estate in the late 90s, but had backed out after a strange encounter with Evelyn Row. She remembered feeling manipulated and unsure. Another message came from a retired housekeeper named Teresa, the same one mentioned in Natalie's journal. She agreed to meet with the police and confirmed that she had overheard an argument between Natalie and Evan just days before the wedding. She had resigned after realizing something was very wrong and had been afraid to come forward. Belridge changed after the story was published. The town council held a meeting to discuss the estate's future. There were proposals to rename the property in Natalie's memory or to establish a scholarship in her name. The historical trust came under review, and Evelyn quietly resigned from all public committees. Evan, now living out of state, declined to comment when reporters reached out, but he was no longer welcome in Belridge. The whispers that had once surrounded Natalie's disappearance began to dissolve, replaced by clarity and sorrow. The estate remained quiet, but it was no longer haunted by ambiguity. It had become a place of reckoning. Lila stayed in Belridge longer than she expected. She took a short-term lease on a cottage near the edge of town and began working on a book. It was not just about Natalie. It was about silence, complicity, and the quiet power of remembering. She realized that uncovering truth was not about solving a puzzle, but about restoring a voice. Natalie had been reduced to a headline for years, her story told in speculation and rumor. But now she was a person again. She had dreams, fears, intelligence, and love. She had been silenced, but not erased. One morning in late spring, Lila visited the estate for the final time. She walked the garden path now cleared of weeds and left a small white rose on the sundial. Then she turned toward the gate and locked the door behind her. The keys, which once opened secrets, now belonged to the town. The house would be preserved, but not as a mystery. It would stand as a place where truth was unearthed, where a forgotten woman found justice, and where a community learned that remembering matters. If you found this story gripping, make sure to like and subscribe for more mystery-driven narratives based on chilling real-life themes. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts help shape the next story.